I'm sure you're all looking forward to what should be a thrilling debate. And on behalf of the congregation, I'd like to thank Yahya, as well as Professor David, and David, the moderator, for their presence today. And I hope that everybody can respect each other's opinions, however controversial the opinions may sound, and however sharp they are stated. If we can all learn to show respect for each other, then hopefully we can have a peaceful coexistence with one another in the society in which we build. So let's welcome everybody who has come to the mosque with the loudest of salawat.
Hello, good evening and welcome. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and good evening and welcome to any Christians who are here this evening. This is the fourth event of the series with the fearsomely evocative title of The Americans Are Coming. It's a week of debates pitting American evangelical speakers of Acts 17 ministries with experienced Muslim speakers living in the UK to share thoughts, ideas, and present the case for their respective viewpoints in the presence of open criticism. My name is Paul Williams, not David, Paul Williams. The series is hosted by Muslim Debate Initiative, or MDI, an intellectual, political, theological initiative formed by experienced Muslim researchers, debaters and speakers aimed at encouraging inter-community debate, discussion and dialogue. MDI believes that only through frank and open debate can deeper understanding be gained, relations between different communities be improved, and hopefully the breaking down of prejudice and false conceptions. It's with this in mind that we invited our honoured guests to come and present to you today's event, which is Was Muhammad a True Prophet? On my right is Dr. David Wood. He's a teaching fellow in philosophy at Fordham University in America. A former atheist, he became a Christian after investigating the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. He is co-director of Acts 17 Apologetics Ministries, has been in more than 24 public debates with Muslims and atheists, and is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers. David lives in the Bronx, New York, which I'm told is a great place to live, with his wife Marie, his sons Lucian, Blaise and Reed. Yahya on my right is a former Roman Catholic who embraced Islam as a teenager, and after being tested in his faith during his studies in London, England, he devoted a solid 2-year block to investigating the evidence for Islam and Christianity. After finding Islam stood on very firm ground in comparison with Christianity, Yahya decided to become involved in Islamic apologetics. Yahya is currently studying to finish his degree in Islamic Studies at university, and is also studying traditional Islamic studies at the Shia Islamic Seminary in London. He currently lives in London with his wife, and shall be leaving soon for a year in Syria to further his studies of classical Arabic. The event this evening will proceed as follows. There will be an opening presentation by the Muslim and Christian speakers on the subject Was Muhammad a True Prophet? This will be for 30 minutes each. After that there will be a rebuttal period of 10 minutes each. Each side will have that 10-minute period to rebut the other side. After that we're going straight into a question and comment session from you, the audience. We very much value participation and comments from you as well. And at the end of that, there will be a summary, about 5 minutes each from each of the speakers. I'd like to explain a bit about the rules this evening. There are some rules. No one shall shout, jeer, or disrupt the speakers while they are speaking. Anyone who wishes to make comments should save them for later, during the audience participation session at the end, the Q&A session. Applause is allowed at the end of the speaker's discussion. Can you make sure that any mobile phones or cell phones are switched off or silenced from now on, please? And we aim to finish at 9:20 to allow for prayers shortly thereafter. We'd also like to remind everyone that in accordance with the Islamic principles of Muslim Debate Initiative, and the commonly understood principles of the etiquette of discussion, that we should respect everyone's right to hold opinions and express them, even the most unpalatable ones, as long as they are expressed sincerely and for intellectually serious purposes, but not gratuitously and in a disrespectful fashion. We hope you enjoy this evening and gain a deeper insight into the Muslim-Christian dialogue and debate. And without any further fuss on my part, I'd like to invite Yahya to give his opening presentation for 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Is my working? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-anbiya wa mursalin Sayyidina wa habibina wa habibi qulubina Abul Qasim Muhammad wa ala ahlihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin al-ma'sumin. Sorry, could I just get the brother to upload the PowerPoint, if that's okay, inshallah? Okay, well, tonight I've been asked to, well, I'm going to be debating my colleague, Professor Wood over here, on who was Muhammad. As Paul has rightly said, I am a convert from Roman Catholicism, and tonight basically I'm going to give you the reasons for why I accepted Islam and accepted the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a prophet of God. Next slide, please. I'm basically just going to introduce the Muslim belief in regards to Muhammad. Number one, we as Muslims believe that Muhammad was a prophet of God, in that he received revelation from God. Number two, we believe he was a messenger of God, namely he received a sacred text with a holistic message containing law for mankind. And tonight I'm going to defend both of these contentions. Next slide, please. The first slide I started off with is what can be known about Muhammad historically. One of my favorite areas of research is the historical Muhammad, and here I've just quoted an introductory comment from the revisionist historian Patricia Prone, who is Professor of Islamic History at Princeton University. She says, and I quote, "We probably know more about Muhammad than we do about Jesus, let alone Moses or Buddha, and we certainly have a potential to know a great deal more." Next slide, please. I'm just introducing the sources which one has to go back to for Muhammad. Number one, we have the Quran. Number two, we have the Sirah Maghazi literature, which my colleague David Wood likes to bring up a lot, and we can get into that later on. We have the Tarikh, which is the historical compilations, and we have the Ahadith, which is basically the sayings, the actions, and the tacit approval of our Prophet and the holy Imams, alayhi salam. And we also have the contemporary, near-contemporary, non-Muslim sources regarding Muhammad, which include the Jewish, Zoroastrian, and Christian documentation. The first question I want to start off with is, since we know that Muhammad was claiming to be a prophet of God, was he sincere in his claims? And I'm going to quote two Orientalists here. The first one being Montgomery Watt, who was the last of the Orientalists and used to teach in my home place in Scotland. He says, and I quote, "Only a profound belief in himself and his mission explains Muhammad's readiness to endure hardship and persecution during the Meccan period, when from a secular point of view there was no prospect of success. There is thus a strong case for holding that Muhammad was sincere." Next to him, Bernard Lewis, no friend of Islam, might I add, says, "The modern historian will not readily believe that so great and significant a movement was started by a self-seeking impostor." I believe my friend David Wood actually concedes that Muhammad was sincere, so I can move on from this slide. Next slide, please. Therefore, sincerity has been established. However, as my friend Professor Wood shall kindly point out, one can be sincerely wrong. I shall therefore begin to give several reasons for why I do accept the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Next slide, please. Prophecies of Muhammad himself. When I deal with prophecies from the Hadith, I don't want to go to isolated Hadith here and there, because we have many isolated Hadith which say things. Instead, I'm going to go for things which have been narrated frequently. So that following Hadith I'm quoting is actually Mashur, and it comes from both the books of the Sunni and the Shia. The Hadith says, "O Ali, alayhi salam, my ummah will fragment into schisms over you, much like the people fragmented over the status of Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary, alayhi salam." Basically, this narration tells us that the ummah will fragment into various sects and schisms over Ali ibn Abi Talib, just as the children of Israel fragmented over the nature of Isa, son of Maryam. Next slide, please. This hadith was fulfilled in the time of the Khawarij, when we had those who would curse Ali and call him a non-Muslim and revile him as a breaker of the law, much like the Jews would do in their sources about Jesus. It again was realized to a greater extent when the Umayyads began hunting down any pro-Alids, and Hajjaj bin Yusuf began the great execution of anyone who claimed to follow Ali alayhi salam. So basically, it reminds us of the Roman persecution of the early followers of Jesus. Next slide, please. It took a new life when those in the lifetime of Ali began calling him God. And final sequence of this hadith and this prophecy is today we now have a sect in Turkey called the Bektashi Alawiyya, who did not come around until the 10th century, who believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib is part of the Trinity with Allah and Muhammad, may God be exalted over such things. So here what we have is a 10th century schism, calling Ali part of the Trinity, when this hadith was recorded down in the 8th century. Wood might argue that this hadith was self-fulfilling, but I don't think any Muslims are going to be joining the bandwagon to form a sect where they believe in shirk. And next slide, please. I've just added up a little comparison of this prophecy and the accurateness of it. The Muslims over Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first, the Khawarij, they reviled him and called him an infidel. Just like the Jews over Jesus, they reviled him and called him the son of an adulteress. The second, they accepted his rightful position. The second, with the Christians, they accepted his rightful position, his rightful position as a prophet. And the third, they deified him and trinitized him. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to deal with the foremost argument for why I accepted Muhammad, the Quran itself. Before elaborating further, I'm going to discuss our belief vis-a-vis the Nabi in the Quran. I'm going to elaborate into the proofs of the Quran's divine origin and its very miraculous nature, and I shall end with an explanation of a Quranic acid test for one to disprove the very foundations of Islam, and I'm going to, at the end, show an attempt made by someone in history. What the Muslims believe in regards to the Quranic narrative. We believe it is direct revelation. In Arabic we say tanzil. It's not merely inspired as the Christians hold of their Gospels, and we believe that it is free from Muhammad's own human thoughts or interventions. Next slide, please. Sorry, brother, next slide, please. Is Muhammad not the author of the Quran? The author of the Quran, according to most people that have studied the Quran, he does not in any way fit the psychological profile of Muhammad, who is known by his contemporaries as being as-Sadiq wal-Amin, whereas the Quran describes, the author describes himself as Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, he describes himself as the most great, whereas someone as humble as Muhammad we would not expect to be describing himself in such a way. The Quran can sometimes even be harsh on a prophet, seemingly, and at other times comes down to comfort him. Again, this does not seem to be the product of Muhammad's mind. And the Quran brings forth information which, as I shall show, would not have been available to the Prophet Muhammad in 6th century Arabia. Miracle number 1. The defeat of the Romans resurfacing as victory. The surah begins off, this is in Surah Al-Rum. Alif Lam Mim. The Romans have been defeated in the nearer or lowest land, and they, after their defeat, will be victorious. Within 3 to 9 years, the decision of the matter before and after these events is only with Allah. Before the defeat of the Romans by the Persians, and after, i.e. the defeat of the Persians by the Romans. And on that day, the believers, i.e. the Muslims, will rejoice at the victory given by Allah to the Romans against the Persians. Now, one might ask, how is this prophecy miraculous? The historical background. The prophecy is miraculous because it deals with the great moral defeat that the Romans suffered at the hands of the Persians. They had just lost Jerusalem, which was their spiritual capital, and no doubt suffered a great blow to their morale, and the cross was even taken from them, losing much of their territories also. And at this point, no one really expected a turnaround. And I'm just going to explain why the believers would be rejoicing at the victory of the Romans. Because the mushrikeen, the pagans in the time of Muhammad, were taunting the Muslims in regards to the Persians, who were also mushrikeen, fighting the monotheists who were the Romans, saying that, look, the Persians are defeating your God and your beloved and your believing brothers in the one God. So they were taunting them over this. This is why the believers were rejoicing at the mushrikeen's taunts. Next slide, please. Miracle number 2, the prophecy of Al-Khawfa. We begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna a'tayna al-Khawthar, فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ إِنَّ شَنِيعَكَ هُوَ الْأَبْتَرُ. Basically, it's translated as, surely Muhammad, we have given you abundance of goods, therefore turn to your Lord in prayer and sacrifice. Surely your enemy is the one without offspring. The following story is revealed on the occasion of As ibn Wa'il, who was a mushrik and one of the chiefs of the pagans. He met with the Holy Prophet coming out of the sacred mosque and spoke with him for a while. In the meantime, a group of authoritative men from the Quraysh came and asked him, who were you speaking to? And As ibn Wa'il replied, with this Abtar one. Basically, Abtar means one without descendants. And basically this prophecy means that who's the one with literally thousands of descendants in the world today? And who's the one we don't know of anymore? Who's Abtar? I would say it's As ibn Wa'il. Next slide, please. Miraculous accuracy of the Quran in terms of history. Unlike the Old Testament found in the Bible, which is now proven to contain a historical mistake or anachronism by referring to the ruler of Egypt in Joseph's time and Abraham's time, ironically enough, as Pharaoh, the Quran refers to the ruler in the time of Joseph's stay in Egypt with Malik, a generic word for king. And there I've just quoted a Quranic ayah demonstrating that it uses the word king, not Pharaoh. Next slide, please. What the Egyptologists say. Pharaoh, a term used regularly by modern writers to refer to the Egyptian king. The word is Greek form of the ancient Egyptian phrase Tab'a, the great house, which was originally used to refer to the royal palace rather than the king. The great house was responsible for taxation of the lesser houses as the temple lands and private estates. From the New Kingdom, that's 550 to 1069 BC onwards, the term was used to refer to the king himself. And that's from the British Museum Dictionary of Ancient Egypt. And there I've just included a nice little diagram for you all to look at. Next slide, please. When the experts on history and Egyptology place Joseph? Well, there are two well-known hypotheses. The first one is that he entered Egypt during the time of the Hyksos. Now, about 80% of scholars believe this one. And this is around 1630 when they seized power and the Hyksos became the kings of Egypt as the 15th dynasty. The second one is that Joseph's entry into Egypt took place during the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. The ruler during his time is supposed to be Sesostris III. Next slide, please. Now, I've just included a little timeline of events according to Egyptologists and experts. No patriarch apparently lived in the Old Kingdom. In the first intermediate kingdom we have Abraham, but it's these Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate periods that I want you to look at, because no matter when they placed Joseph in either of these two, the word Pharaoh is definitely proven to be an anachronism. And so the Quranic use of the word Malik is generally considered very apt. And it's a miracle because the Rosetta Stone, which carries the translation of all the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, could not have been available to Muhammad at the time. Therefore, how did he get this knowledge from? Next slide, please. In conclusion to the Quranic usage of the word Malik, I've included a quote from the Encyclopedia of the Bible. It says, the use of the title Pharaoh in Genesis may be anachronistic in that Moses, in covering the events of the patriarchs in relation to Egypt, used the commonly accepted word Pharaoh. I might add that not many people believe Genesis was written by Moses, but sure. Even though the title was not in use at the time of the patriarchs. So this Encyclopedia of the Bible is agreeing with us. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to deal with Moses and the Pharaoh, identifying the Pharaoh of the Quran. Now this is quite an interesting issue for me because Mr. Wood's favorite website on Islam, Answering Islam, claims that the Pharaoh of the Quran is a figure that did not exist in history, and that basically he's a Pharaoh that time forgot. So tonight I'm going to discuss the Quranic's identification of Pharaoh. According to the Quran, there are several clues to identify who the ruler of the time of Moses was. Using the archaeological evidence, the Islamic Awareness Team and several other Muslims have attempted to find the ruler in history, whom for some time was believed to be a fictitious ruler. Again, I've included that from Answering Islam, Professor Wood's favorite resource on Islam. Keys for identifying the Pharaoh of Moses' time. Number one, the Quran calls him Dhul Autad. Autad is acknowledged by Ibn Abbas to mean buildings, and that's in the Quran, Surah 38, Ayah 10 to 13. Pharaoh considered himself the god above all gods. That's in the Quran, Ayah 79, 15 to 24. Remained a contemporary of Moses from childhood to adulthood. That's again, you can find it in the Quran, verse 28, verse 14. And he was preserved as a sign for those who would come after. That's in the Quran, Surah 10, ayah 19 to 92. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry, that's great. The Pharaoh of Dhul-Autad. I've just included two quotes from biblical scholars, biblical archaeologists rather, about Ramesses II. But certainly his building works were for gods, the enterprise that left Egypt and Nubia. Ramesses II surpassed not only the 18th dynasty, but every other period in Egyptian history. In that realm, he certainly fulfilled the dynasty's aim for society. Now that's Kitchener talking about how Ramesses was renowned for his building works. Below we have another quote from Clayton, another Egyptologist historian, who says the same thing. I'm not going to quote that because I don't want to run out of time. Next slide, please. Ramesses II, the god above all gods. Now, Answering Islam was favourite resource on Islam. Attacked the Muslims, saying that they included an anachronism in the Quran, which is that Pharaoh's never considered himself to be a god above all gods. Rather, he's considered himself to be one of the gods. And that would generally be a true trend in Egyptian history. However, looking at this archaeological inscription of Ramesses II, we find that he's worshipping himself as the highest god. Now, this indeed has been recognized as a unique phenomenon throughout ancient Egyptian history. Next slide, please. The contemporary of Moses from birth till death. According to the archaeological information available at the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphical records, only two pharaohs could have lived as long as Moses and lived as contemporaries of him from birth till his middle age. Namely, number one, Thutmose the third of the 18th dynasty, and Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty. Naturally, we would say it's more probable to be Ramesses given the other identifications given in the Quran. Next slide, please. The pharaoh who became a sign. The Quran and the Bible state that the pharaoh was drowned in the sea. However, the Quran differs from the Bible in that it makes a very unique statement that the body of the drowned pharaoh was saved as a sign for the future generations. The Quranic statement about rescuing Pharaoh's body would be in total agreement with the fact that the body of Ramesses II has survived in mummified form. It was discovered in 1881 among a group of royal mummies that had been removed from their original tombs for fear of theft. Priests of the 21st dynasty had reburied them in a cage at Deir al-Bahari on Luxor's West Bank. So, we find that the Pharaoh of the Quran very much is a person in history, and the Quran miraculously seems to give us enough biographical details to line up with secular archaeological evidence. Now I'm going to move on to the acid test, the literary challenge of the Quran. The Quran says in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 23, "And if you are in doubt as to what we have revealed from time to time to our servants, then produce a surah like thereunto, and call your witnesses or helpers if there are any besides God, if your doubts are true." Next slide, please. I'm first going to go into the definition of a miracle to show how the Quran is actually miraculous in this sense. What's the definition of a miracle? The logical, coherent definition of a miracle is events which lie outside the productive capacity of nature. And this is a quote from Dr. William Lane Craig, one of David Wood's favorite Christian apologists and philosophers. What this means is that miracles are acts of impossibilities concerning causal or logical connections. Next slide, please. I'm going to elaborate further on what I mean by miracle. For example, we have natural law. Event A, the sun rotating on its axis causes event B different times of the day. Event B can only come about by event A. The event B is entirely dependent on event A, and if event B were to occur independent of event A, this would be a miracle. Therefore, the change of time in this context is beyond the productive capacity of nature. Next slide, please. Why is the Quran a miracle? Now, I'm going to put forward the following clip. The Quran employs a unique literary genre, which is recognized as being none of the following literary genres, which all other forms of Arabic expression fall under. Namely, number one, Arabic poetry. Number two, rhymed prose, known in Arabic as saj'a. And number three, mursal, which is basically straightforward speech. Next slide, please. Sorry. The meters of Arabic poetry. All poetry, whether pre-Islamic or post-Islamic, falls under one of the following meters. Now there's actually 16 poetic meters. Just to give you a nice visual aid, I've decided to type up 8 of them. I didn't really have the time nor effort to type up the other 8, so you'll have to excuse me. Number 1 is Atawil. Oh, I don't really need to go into the names, needless to say. Next slide, please. Louis Shako and Arabic poetry. Opposite, I've included a diagram of how Surah Al-Kawthar breaks all the meters and falls into none. Louis Shako, a non-Muslim Arabist, has analysed Arabic poetry both prior to Islam and post-Islamic. That includes Mu'allafa as-Saba, and he concludes that all Arabic poetry falls into the meters. And you can find this in the book Louis Shako, Shu'ara an-Nasaraniya, 1890 to 1891, and that's published in Beirut. Next slide, please. Some Arabists have claimed that the Quran falls into sajda. Now tonight, I'm going to contest that and show why it doesn't. The following is a definition of sajda given by the Quranic scientist known as Ahmed von Denfer. He says, and I quote, "A literary form with some emphasis on rhythm and rhyme, but distinct from poetry. Sajda is not really something as sophisticated as poetry, but has been employed by Arab poets and is the best known of the pre-Islamic prosodies. It is distinct from poetry in its lack of meter, and it has not consistent rhythmical pattern it shares with poetry. The element of rhyme will in many cases somewhat irregularly employed." Despite the fact that there are numerous early 19th century Arabists who posited the Quran fell into sajda, there are numerous ways to demonstrate that it does not. Next slide, please. Quranic sajda. Now this is an interesting title because basically the Arabists and Orientalists had to create a new category of literary expression called Quranic sajda. I don't know why it's called sajda, but most Arabists, noting that they can no longer claim the Quran as sajda, have created a new division of Arabic expression known as Quranic sajda. Their reasoning is that in the Quran, the use of language is semantically orientated and its literary structure is distinct, whereas in sajda, conformity to style is a primary objective. Furthermore, the Quran uses literary and linguistic devices in such a way that one that has not been used before and achieves an unparalleled cumulative effect. Next slide, please. Is the Quran mursal? Now, I've never met anyone that's claimed the Quran is mursal. The Quran is not straightforward speech. This is due to the use of rhyme, rhythm, and unique stylistic features abundant in the Quranic discourse. Mursal is just normal speech that doesn't employ any of the above features. A superficial analysis on Surah Al-Kawthar will conclude that it cannot be described as normal speech. إِنَّا أَتَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ إِنَّا شَنَاعِكَ هُوَ الْأَبْتَرُ. This chapter employs an end rhyme which can be seen by the end letters in bold and the repetition of ka. It is responsible for the chapter's rhythm which differs from all of the bihar. Next slide, please. So what do the greatest Arabists of our time say about the genre? A.J. Arbery, renowned for translating the Quran and numerous Mu'allafa as-Saba, no child in Arabic grammar or Arabic studies, says, "For the Quran is neither prose nor poetry, but a unique fusion of both." Taha Hussein, who was teaching at the Al-Azhar and became an academic in Egypt, however, is not known to be pro-traditional Islam and is known for his knowledge of the Arabic language, says Arabic composition should be divided into 3 categories: prose, verse, and Quran, such forming a part of the prose, but the Quran being a category of its own. And lastly, we have Professor Bruce Lawrence, a Western academic who's written much on the Quran, saying, "As tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning layered with meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle." Next slide, please. So basically, just to sum this up, I've taken this nice chart from my friend. The Quran vis-a-vis Quranic expression. Outside the productive nature of the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language, we have the Quran. And inside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic, we have the other forms of Arabic expression. Next slide, please. Concluding remarks on the miracle of the Quran. Any expression of the Arabic language falls into its known categorized literary forms of prose, either sajda or mursal, or it falls under poetry. We've demonstrated that the Quran does neither. Prose and poetry are inside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language. The Quran is unique and does not fit into the known divisions of the Arabic language. Therefore, the Quran is not inside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language. Next slide, please. So, another question we might want to ask ourselves is, who produced the Quran? With regards to the Quran, the universally accepted statement is that the Arabs at the time of revelation reached the peak of expressing themselves in Arabic language. The Quran came with a challenge to produce merely free lines like Surah Al-Kawthar that will match the linguistic and literary reality of the text. Many at the time of the revelation attempted to challenge the Quran, and as can be seen by the preserved written challenges, they all failed. They came to the conclusion that it was a form of magic, and what is interesting to note is that they never claimed that Muhammad was the author of the Quran. Next slide, please. Possibilities of authorship. Number 1, a non-Arab. Number 2, an Arab. Number 3, the Prophet himself. Or number 4, a divine being. Next slide, please. A non-Arab. The Quran is matchless in its Arabic and is beyond comparison amongst other literature. It defies sense for it to have been written by someone who could not understand the Arabic language. Think of the literary work in English, e.g. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Could one without English have been the author of any of these texts? Do the same for literature in other languages. For example, Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy in Iranian, Cervantes' Don Quixote, Tolstoy's War and Peace, Aristophanes' Clouds, and so on. It would not be serious to claim that such a work could be achieved without access to the language itself, and therefore the first option of a non-Arab offering the Quran can safely be eliminated. Next slide, please. An Arab. If the Quran was offered by an Arab, then the test of inimitability would not pose a real challenge, just as it does not in any other language. Whatever one writes, another can write a letter in the same style, but the challenge has been attempted by leading authorities in Arabic throughout history and has left all exhausted. Whenever an Arab attempts a passage trying to imitate the Quran's style and literary form, he or she remains utterly elusive, so we can safely state that the author of the Quran could not have been an Arab. Next slide, please. Was it Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Muhammad, for all his greatness, was still an Arab, just like the rest of his contemporaries. It is also a matter of fact that the Prophet Muhammad was never accused of offering the Quran by his contemporaries, even those who sought his death and ruin. Furthermore, the hadith, the recorded narrations attributed to the Prophet, are in total different styles of the Quran. And believe me, narrations from the Prophet do have their own distinct style. How can any man speak with two distinctly different styles over a 23-year period? Next slide, please. Now I come to the most probable, the most plausible explanation, the Creator. As we have eradicated all other options, the most probable and plausible explanation appears to be the Creator himself. However, we have provided an acid test for disproving the veracity of Muhammad's prophethood, which can be attempted by anyone using the tools of the Arabic language. Produce a chapter like the Quran in that it breaks the literary forms of the Arabic expression, without wholesale copy and pasting of the Quran, that is. Conclusions. I accept Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as a prophet of God. Number 1, because Muhammad's prophecies in widely attested hadith which seem to come true. Number 2, because of the prophecies of the Quran. Number 3, because of the historically miraculous accuracy of the Quran. And number 4, because of the utter literary miracle of the Quran. Now, I'm going to ask the brother in the room to load up another file for me, and I'm going to explain what the relevance of this file is.
The 1.5 minutes.
Sure. Okay.
Safe to do it.
Basically, while I'm waiting for the brother to load up this file, Professor Wood's colleagues on his blog Answering Muslims and his colleague Michael Kona have claimed that the true Quran, written by the Arabic Christian Anis Sarosh, has met the literary challenge of the Quran. I'm about to load up a document which shall show you what exactly the true Quran is. That is, if the brother does manage to upload the document within the time frame provided.
1 minute.
It's in a folder called Presentation. I've uploaded it onto the desktop. You're free to pause.
Yeah, we're going to pause it until Yahya can get this.
You finished? Okay, we now have the second opening presentation by David Wood on the same subject, and he has 30 minutes as well.
It's good? You hear me? Fire up.
You got a mic?
How's that? Very good? No, it's good. Check.
No, it's not
Should I
translating.
take that?
Do you want to take this?
Take pause.
Yeah.
Yeah, just skip that.
Check. All right. Well, good evening. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I'd like to thank Yahya for his opening statement. I think Yahya is the only Shia Muslim I've ever debated.
Move it away from you.
Okay.
Move the mic away from you. It's feedback.
All right, I think Yahya is the only Shia I've debated. Well, you're definitely the only Scottish Filipino Shia Muslim I've debated. I'd also like to thank the mosque here for hosting us. Everyone has been very kind and gracious since I got here. And that actually messes me up a bit in debate, because then I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings because everyone's being so nice. So if you want a good debate, be a little more mean sometimes, and we'll get something going. If you're here, my goal is not to offend you, but if you showed up to an event like this, I assume that you are prepared to have your beliefs challenged and criticized. What's that?
Sorry, have you got the other one?
No.
We're using that. We're fine, thank you.
Okay, fine. The mic's over there. But just pause it.
You want this?
Because otherwise they can feed.
Come on, David.
Sorry.
Is this what you mean, man? Check.
Because I can't hear anything.
Check.
Is it turned on? It's not turned on.
It's got a red line.
Does anyone know how to use this so we can switch it on?
David, just say this.
Take the chair here. Check. Bring it.
All right, you ready? All right, so again, if you're here, my goal is not to offend you, but if you showed up to an event like this, I assume that you're prepared to have your beliefs challenged and criticized. So why don't Christians believe that Muhammad was a prophet? I'm representing the Christian position tonight. And the most obvious answer is that Christians believe in the gospel. We believe the heart of the Christian gospel, which consists of three core facts. Jesus died on the cross for sins, rose from the dead, and claimed to be divine. If those three things are true, then Christianity is true. So these are the three core elements of the Christian gospel. When we go to history, when we go to the Gospels, when we go to the early Christian writings, we always find these three key elements. Now we're also told in the New Testament that false prophets would come, and that these false prophets would try to distort the gospel. So if a Christian says, all right, what kind of prophets am I going to expect if they're preaching a false message? We're going to expect someone who denies that Jesus died on the cross, or who denies that Jesus claimed to be divine. And then a little 6 centuries or so after Jesus comes along and says, You Christians believe in God? Me too. You believe Jesus performed miracles? That's what I believe. You believe Jesus was the Messiah? That's exactly what I teach. I agree with you on almost everything. In fact, there are only three things I really want to disagree with you about. Jesus wasn't the divine Son of God, he didn't die on the cross, and he never rose from the dead. If you guys get rid of those three things, we can be in complete agreement. Well, when a Christian hears that, an alarm goes off. Wait a minute, we're told that these are the core elements of the Christian gospel, and we're told that false prophets are going to come and try to corrupt this message. And then a prophet comes along and says, well, deny these three things. So for a Christian who has examined the historical case for Christianity, Islam looks very suspicious right from the beginning, because we're told that someone's going to come along and deny the gospel. But we do have to examine the Muslim arguments, because I believe that there is very good evidence for Christianity, but suppose there's better evidence for Islam. Suppose there are some slam dunk arguments that are more powerful than Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Well, I would have to consider these arguments. So let's go a little further and examine some of the Muslim claims. The Quran offers several ways that we can test this, and this is very important. Some religious claims offer no way of verifying them. Christianity says, if you want to know that Christianity is true, check out the resurrection. Jesus rose from the dead, therefore it's true. Islam offers similar claims that we can examine to know whether the religion is true. And we'll look at a few lines of evidence offered by the Quran to see whether it passes its own tests. Now, Yahya has appealed to the unique literary style of the Quran. He's appealed to the unique meter of the Quran. This comes from Surah 223. If you are in doubt as to that which we have revealed to our servant, then produce a chapter like it and call on your witnesses if you are truthful. So according to this verse, how do we know? This is similar to the resurrection in Christianity. This is how we know that Islam is true. And apparently, according to Yahya, we know that the Quran is the Word of God because no one can write something as amazing as one of the chapters of the Quran. Now notice, this would be like me saying, if you can't produce something like a symphony of Mozart, you have to admit that that's the inspired music of God. Or if you can't write a play like Shakespeare, or if you can't write a book like Charles Dickens, you have to admit that these books are the inspired Word of God. Well, I'm guessing that none of us in here, or all of us working together, could not write a play like Shakespeare, or a book like Charles Dickens, or a symphony like Mozart. Does that have anything at all to do with whether these works are from God? I'd say it doesn't. I'd say it has absolutely nothing. In fact, if I were to go and find someone who's the greatest expert, the greatest masterful writer of all time in some genre, I wouldn't think that that has anything to do with whether it's from God. I would simply conclude that this person is the best at what he did. So even if I were to examine the Quran and I were to find that I could just never, ever write anything like it, I would think that this has absolutely nothing to do with whether it came from God. So that's one problem with this argument. I don't think it makes much sense. But there's another problem. Like it or not, at least to non-Muslims, the Quran isn't all that impressive. Let's consider two short chapters. Well, let's consider one chapter of the Quran. Say, O unbelievers, I do not serve that which you serve, nor do you serve him whom I serve. Nor am I going to serve that which you serve, nor are you going to serve him whom I serve. You shall have your religion, and I shall have my religion. According to Yahya, this surah is so amazing that no one could ever hope to write anything like it. Now, let's be honest, is there anything miraculous here? Is there something so incredibly unique in these words that we just have to bow down when we hear them? No, there isn't. These are words that could have been written by just about anyone. Now, I know what every Muslim in the room is thinking of, but it only works in Arabic. Well, there are several problems with this response. First, what is Surah 109 in English? It's a series of words, one after another, arranged to convey some sort of meaning. What is Surah 109 in Arabic? It's a series of words, one after another, arranged to convey some sort of meaning. And that's the problem with this argument. In order to show that this argument works, you have to show that a human being couldn't possibly put words in this order. Now the reason this is flawed is human beings can put words in any order we like. And so to say that words could not have been put in this order by a human being is simply flawed. Second, if the Muslim argument only works in Arabic, I'd say very few people are capable of even examining the main argument for Islam. There are nearly 7,000 known languages in the world. The evidence for God's existence works in every one of them. The evidence for Christianity can be understood in any one of them. Jesus rose from the dead, so you better listen to him. But all of a sudden, when we get to the Quran, we get an argument that someone can only examine if he's lucky enough to speak Arabic. Indeed, even native Arabic speakers can't seriously investigate this claim because very few are trained in classical Arabic. And even those who are trained in classical Arabic generally aren't experts in Arabic literary styles. So it seems that the main argument of the Quran is something that practically no one can ever even hope to investigate. Again, compare this with Jesus' resurrection. Third, everyone grants that something gets lost in translation, but at the same time, a great deal of content and style remain. Many written works are eloquent and powerful even after translation. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 13, for instance, are beautiful and meaningful even after being translated from the Greek. So if literary style cannot be translated out of the Arabic, why wasn't the Quran revealed in a more suitable language where if the main argument is this beauty and eloquence, we could investigate it in other parts of the world? Fourth, even people who aren't fortunate enough to speak Arabic can investigate this claim indirectly, because we can go to history and see how Arabic speakers have responded to the Quran. And when we do this, we find that many people from the time of Muhammad on have been utterly unimpressed by the Quran. Ironically, we know this from the Quran itself. In Surah 831 we read, "When our signs are rehearsed to them, they say, 'We have heard this before. If we wished, we could say words like these. These are nothing but tales of the ancients.'" So this was the reaction of the people when Muhammad delivered these words. We could write words like this. They didn't seem that impressed. In his book, 23 Years, Iranian scholar Ali Dashti admits his view of the Quran. He says, "The Quran contains sentences which are incomplete and not fully intelligible without the aid of commentaries, foreign words, unfamiliar Arabic words, and words used with other than the normal meaning. Adjectives and verbs inflected without observance of the concords of gender and number, illogically and ungrammatically applied pronouns which sometimes have no referent, and predicates which in rhymed passages are often remote from the subjects. These and other such aberrations in the language have given scope to critics who deny the Quran's eloquence." Gerrit Arkulin is the world's foremost authority on Quranic paleography. He says this about the Quran. "The Quran claims for itself that it is mubin, or clear. But if you look at it, you will notice that every fifth sentence or so simply doesn't make sense. Many Muslims will tell you otherwise, of course, but the fact is that a fifth of the Quranic text is just incomprehensible. This is what has caused the traditional anxiety regarding translation. If the Quran is not comprehensible, if it can't even be understood in Arabic, then it's not translatable into any language. That is why Muslims are afraid. Since the Quran claims repeatedly to be clear, but it is not, there is an obvious and serious contradiction." So Muhammad delivers the Quran to people and they say, "We could write something like this." Were they impressed by the Quran? No. So there are two main problems with this argument. Muhammad's claim that literary excellence of the Quran shows that it's from God. One, the argument just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to base your theology on unique literary style. And two, even if the argument did make sense, it doesn't seem that the Quran is as impressive as it claims to be. So I'd say that this argument fails on multiple levels. Second, the Quran appeals to its perfect internal consistency as proof of its divine origin. Surah 482 says, "Do they not then meditate on the Quran? And if it were from other than Allah, they would have found in it many a discrepancy." One of my translations here of the Quran adds a footnote to this verse. It says, "The Holy Quran being of divine authorship, reflects a perfect consistency to all who are prepared to consider it carefully. The beauty, spiritual simplicity, and complete lack of error are, to those who look carefully and with pure hearts, a sufficient proof of its divine origin. So 2 claims are made. 1, perfect consistency, and 2, complete lack of error. I'm not sure how carefully people are reading the Quran when they make these claims. Now, I understand that we can always reinterpret things, but if you're coming to this as a non-Muslim, and you see right here, the Quran offers you a way to test whether it's the Word of God. It's saying this is how you can know whether it's the Word of God. Well, we have to look at this. So let's look at a few difficulties. How long did it take Allah to create the universe? According to 754, it took 6 days. According to 2559, it took 8 days. So you take the second passage and overlap the days a little and fix that. You reinterpret the passage. What did Allah create first, the heavens or the earth? 229 says that the earth was created first, then the heavens. 79, 27 through 30 says that the heavens were created first, then the earth. Who was the first Muslim? 614 says that Muhammad was the first Muslim. 7143 says that Moses was the first Muslim. And yet the Quran also declares that Adam and Abraham were Muslims. The Quran tells us in 1047 that Allah has sent a messenger to every nation. Surah 2 tells us that Abraham and Ishmael came to Arabia. They built the Kaaba. And yet Surah 28:46 claims that Muhammad was the first messenger to come to the Arabs. According to Surah 4:48, committing shirk is unforgivable. Later in the same surah, Allah forgives people for committing shirk. Surah 2:62 says that Jews and Christians don't need to fear because we will be accepted by God. And then 385 says that the only religion that will be accepted by God is Islam. What is man created from? 1967 says that man started as nothing. 96:1 through 2 says that man was created from a clot of blood. 21:30 says that man was created from water. 16:4 says that man was created from a small seed. 15:26 says that man was created from clay. 3:59 says that man was created from dust. 11:61 says that man was created from earth. Will intercession be possible on the day of judgment? Surah 2, Surah 6, and Surah 82 say no. Surah 20, 34, and 48, and 43 say yes. What happened to Pharaoh when he was chasing the Israelites? 1092 says that Allah saved him. 72:103 says he drowned. And of course we have many abrogated verses in the Quran, verses that were later cancelled by other verses. Surah 2, 256 says that there's no compulsion in religion. And 929 says, fight those who do not believe in Allah. Surah 4:15 says that the penalty for sexual sin is house arrest. You get locked up in your house for the rest of your life. Surah 24:2 tells us that the penalty for sexual sin is 100 lashes. In Surah 4:43, Muslims are clearly allowed to drink alcohol, provided they don't show up to prayer drunk. Surah 590 forbids Muslims from drinking any alcohol. Now, we could go on and on with examples like this, and if Muslims want to harmonize these passages, that's fine with me. But think about this for a moment. Muslims generally believe that the Quran is a perfect tablet in heaven. On that perfect tablet are the following 3 claims. 1, the penalty for sexual sin is house arrest. 2, the penalty for sexual sin is 100 lashes. And 3, there are no discrepancies in this book. See, in our world it makes sense that one thing would come after another, but this perfect book in heaven has contradictory verses, and it claims there's no contradiction. This is before anything was revealed. That's a problem. Third, there was another claim in 482, complete lack of error. Is the Quran free from error? Let's look briefly at some scientific errors and then some historical errors, since Yahya wanted to go to history. Surah 1886 tells us that Alexander the Great traveled so far west, he found the place where the sun sets. The sun sets in a pool of murky water, of course. What do you do with this? Well, you reinterpret it and say it was a reflection of a pool, not what it says. We can always reinterpret things. In Surah 27, ants talk to Solomon. In Surah 86, we learn that semen is formed between the ribs and the backbone up here. In Surah 67:5, we learn what stars are. Stars are missiles that God uses to shoot demons when they try to sneak into heaven. Now, you're free to reinterpret all of these if you want, but you're bringing a book to me that says there are no errors in this book. And I look to these, and the most obvious interpretation of them, on the most obvious interpretation, they're false. So I find that the Muslim claim that the Quran is free from error is circular. We have to assume from the beginning that the Quran is the Word of God. That way when we go to it and find all the errors, we can reinterpret them until they're correct. And then once they're all correct, because we've reinterpreted them, we can say, isn't it amazing that Muhammad got all of this right? Well, you can do that with any book. You can take any book from all of history and say, I'm going to reinterpret everything that looks wrong, and then, wow, it's all right. It must be the Word of God. Now, what about historical errors? Yahya says that the Quran uses the word king for Pharaoh, and that the Quran gets many other things right. Well, I would expect someone writing a book to get some things right. I'll point out here that if I were to sit down and write a book about history, I'm not a historian, so I'm going to get certain things right. And if I'm not really writing from God, I would expect to get some things wrong as well. So let's assume that the Quran has gotten many things right. Let's say it's gotten 100 things right. The question is, what does it get wrong? During the time of Muhammad, there were tons of stories circulating in Arabia. Some of these stories were true, some of them were false. Historians can generally separate the true from the false by examining the evidence. But Muhammad didn't know anything about historical investigation, so he couldn't tell the difference between the true stories and the false stories. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. Going back to the story of Alexander the Great, finding the place where the sun sets, we find that it's not only scientifically inaccurate, it's historically false. We know where this story came from. It came from a Syriac work titled The Glorious Deeds of Alexander, which was circulating in Arabia toward the end of Muhammad's life. So think about this. Muhammad tells a very strange story about Dhu al-Qarnayn finding the place where the sun sets going so far west. And then we find out that there was a story called The Glorious Deeds of Alexander circulating in Arabia during the time of Muhammad. What's the obvious conclusion here? That Muhammad sort of picked up a story that's not true. In Surah 18, we read about the companions of the cave, a group who supposedly went to sleep in a cave and woke up 300 years later. This myth was written by Bishop Stephen of Ephesus around the middle of the 5th century. We know exactly where this came from. It was very popular among the Christians of Arabia, but they knew it wasn't true. They treated the story as a myth. It was like a bedtime story. But now it's in the Quran, and more than 1 billion people believe that this is something that really happened. In Surah 21, Muhammad tells us that God miraculously rescued Abraham from a fire. This story is found in the Jewish Talmud, but it was based on a mistranslation of Genesis 15. In the 1st century, a Jewish rabbi named Jonathan ben Uziel was translating Genesis 15 into Aramaic, and he came across the word Jonathan didn't know Babylonian, so he confused the Babylonian word, which just means city called with the Hebrew word which means fire. This mistake caused him to mistranslate the passage, so instead of saying that God delivered Abraham out of of the Chaldees, the city of the Chaldees, he translated it as God delivered Abraham out of the fire of the Chaldees. And so this story, based on a mistranslation, circulated about Abraham being amazingly delivered from a fire. And now we have the same story in the Quran. According to Surah 19, Jesus began preaching as soon as he came out of Mary's womb. Now this is adorable. We got little baby Jesus delivering these little tiny sermons. But we know where this story comes from. It comes from a text called the Arabic Infancy Gospel, which scholars unanimously reject as an obvious forgery. But now this story is in the Quran. The story of a bird teaching Cain how to bury his brother in Surah 5 comes from the Mishnah Sanhedrin. The tale of Solomon talking to animals in Surah 27 comes from the Targum of the Book of Esther. The legend of Mary giving birth under a palm tree in Surah 19 comes from an apocryphal work called The History of the Nativity of Mary. The account of Jesus giving life to clay birds in Surah 5 comes from the Gospel of Thomas the Israelite. No historian claims that these texts are historically reliable. Some of them were on the level of fables. and yet Muhammad didn't know that they were fictitious. Interestingly, we know that from the Quran that people during Muhammad's time were familiar with these stories and that they were accusing Muhammad of copying ancient tales. Now Yahya says no one ever accused Muhammad of writing the Quran. On Surah 16:103 we read, "We know indeed that they say, it is a man who teaches him. The tongue of him they wickedly point to is notably foreign, while this is Arabic, pure and clear." So where's Muhammad getting these stories? He's getting these stories from people who are telling them to him. Is this not accusing him of writing the Quran? We find something similar in Surah 25:4-5. "But the misbelievers say, naught is this but a lie which he has forged, and others have helped him at it. Muhammad has forged a lie, and others have helped him. In truth, it is they who have put forward an iniquity and a falsehood, and they say, tales of the ancients, which he has caused to be written, and they are dictated before him morning and evening." So Muhammad is being accused of hearing stories from others, ancient tales that everyone is familiar with, and people are saying, why are you so impressed with this? He's just getting it from other people. So Muhammad was certainly accused by people of writing the Quran, and they were also accusing him of plagiarism. And notice the answer that the Quran gives in response to this critique. Muhammad couldn't have stolen these sources because these are in Arabic. Now, is that a good response? Muhammad couldn't have been copying these stories from other people because these stories are in Arabic. Well, no, we know that Waraka was translating Christian stories into Arabic. We know that the Jews would explain Jewish stories from Hebrew into Arabic for the Arab listeners. So it's very easy to get these stories circulated around. And I have to say that the Quranic response, that it is impossible to get one story from a different language, isn't very, very satisfying. Fourth, Surah 7:157 tells us that the Torah and the Gospel talk about Muhammad. This is a perfect opportunity to test whether we can trust the Quran. So we go to the Torah and the Gospel, and we don't find anything telling us that Muhammad was a prophet. Indeed, we find just the opposite. According to Deuteronomy 18, Matthew 5, and Galatians 1, based on the criteria of Moses, Jesus, and Paul, Muhammad cannot be a prophet. So the Torah and the Gospel don't confirm the Quran as the Quran claims. Instead, they disconfirm it. But I'd say it gets worse. Surah 10:94 says this, "If you are in doubt as to what we have revealed to you, ask those who read the book before you." So, if you want to know whether Muhammad is a prophet and whether the Quran is the word of God, you're supposed to go to the people who read the book before you. That's Christians and Jews. You're supposed to come to me to ask me whether the Quran is the word of God. No, it's not the word of God. That would be my answer. Now, at this point, Muslims usually say, well, the Bible has been corrupted, so we're not going to ask you anymore. But here I have to ask why Muhammad was commanded to go to Jews and Christians if our books had already been corrupted. And here we find a deeper problem. According to Muhammad and the Quran, God inspired the Torah and the Injil, the law and the Gospel, and they were still available in Muhammad's time. Surah 29:46, "And do not dispute with the followers of the book, except by what is best, except those of them who act unjustly, and say, we believe in that which has been revealed to us and revealed to you, and our God and your God is one, and to him do we submit." Surah 21:33, "And they say, why does he not bring to us a sign from his Lord? Has there not come to them clear evidence of what is in the previous books?" So people still had these books. There was evidence in them. Let's consider two more verses. In the Quran, Surah 5:46-47, "And in their footsteps we sent Jesus, the son of Mary, confirming the law that had come before him. We sent him the gospel, therein was guidance and light, and confirmation of the law that had come before him, a guidance and an admonition to those who fear Allah. Let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah hath revealed therein. If any do fail to judge by the light of what Allah hath revealed, they are no better than those who rebelled. So the Quran commands me, the people of the gospel, to judge based on what I read in the gospel. And what I read in the gospel does not confirm Islam. But now we have a serious problem here, because if Muhammad is telling people to go to the book, to the gospel, and if he tells us that this gospel is the Word of God, there are only two possibilities. Either it's the Word of God or it's not the Word of God. If the gospel is the Word of God, then Muhammad's a false prophet, because we open it up and it does not confirm Islam. It presents a very different message. So if our scriptures, if the scriptures of the Christians are the Word of God, then Muhammad was a false prophet, because it contradicts his teachings. The other possibility is that our scriptures are not the Word of God. And if our scriptures are not the Word of God, then Muhammad was a false prophet, because he told us to go to these scriptures because they're the Word of God. So if the Bible is the Word of God, then Muhammad's a false prophet because it contradicts his message. And if the Bible is not the Word of God, then Muhammad's still a false prophet because he told us to go to this book. I see this as a problem. Now, how long do I have?
1 minute.
1 minute. Going briefly through some of Yahya's arguments, he says we know that we historically know a lot about Muhammad. I would agree. I would say we know a lot about historically about Muhammad and Jesus and Paul and so on. He says Muhammad was sincere. He already knows that I agree with that. The argument from fulfilled prophecy. Muhammad prophesied various things. The Ummah would fragment into various sects. Well, the only record we have of this prophecy comes after the Ummah had split into sects. So I don't know how that would qualify as evidence. He said that there was prophecy that the Romans would win victory after they'd been defeated. Now, think about that for just 1 second. If the United States is defeated somewhere in the world today, and then you hear, but they're going to come back and win a victory. What are the odds? They're going to win a victory in a few years. Well, I'd say roughly 100%. The Romans were a very powerful nation. If they suffer defeat, they're coming back. I don't see as this is confirmation. He's brought up a few points. I'll have to wait for our rebuttal, but thank you for listening.
We now have a rebuttal period. Each speaker will have 10 minutes each to rebut the opponent's views.
Don't throw them on.
Sorry?
Don't throw them on the mic. I need every single second.
Okay.
I'll show them.
Don't worry. When you're ready, we'll begin the 10 minutes timing. So Yahya will start, and then after that, David will respond. Then after that, in 20 minutes' time, we're going to have the question and comments period as well. The floor is over to you.
Thank you, David, for your opening statements. Although I'm a little disappointed, I thought you did say you would restrict your objections to ones I can reasonably respond to within the time allocated. Nevertheless, I'm going to attempt to respond to every single one I can, as I'm sure you know I only have 10 minutes to do so. As regards to Quranic contradictions, I'm going to deal with 3 off the top of my head. I naturally don't have a list of all of them to respond to them. Number 1, intercession. Intercession is forbidden to those things which Allah has not granted intercession to, such as idols, which were not granted permission in the first place. However, intercession is granted to several people other than that. Pharaoh drowning and being saved in one hand. Well, didn't I just talk about the Pharaoh in my presentation, Dr. Wood? The Pharaoh was saved as a sign for mankind. No one said he was saved from drowning, he died of drowning nevertheless. As for drinking, one day it tells you, do not approach the prayer while it's drunk, the next day it tells you, don't drink, full stop. Well, Mr. Wood, you've claimed to study Islam for the past 15 years. I'm sure you're familiar with an issue known as specification of the Quran, where a ruling comes down, then it's further specified to tell you exactly what it means. Now, as for historical anachronisms in the Quran, these things did trouble me at first, and like Dr. Wood, I've just done a very surface reading of it. Fortunately enough, I've done slightly more reading on it than Dr. Wood, so I'm about to deal with those arguments now. As for Alexander and Vulcan, I'm taking this article from the latest book published on this so-called borrowing theory, which states that, like Gilgamesh, the Alexander of this legend travels to the edges of the world, where he comes to a sea where the sun is setting. Now, you know as well as I do, Dr. Woods, that the Quran does not say Vulcarnain came to this, because it doesn't say Vulcarnain literally saw the sun setting in murky waters. It doesn't claim that the sun does set in murky waters. It uses the word wajh alayh. Now, if you want to claim you're better at Arabic than most of the Mufassirin, you can challenge that as a reinterpretation. I don't think you're qualified enough to do so. Secondly, as for the Alexander legend which you quoted, and you said that Zulkarnain is borrowed from it, explain to me why the Alexander legend mentions Arabs conquering the world, and why most academics date this as a post-Islamic apocalyptic source. Because it's mentioned Arabs conquering the world, most people date it as a post-Islamic apocalyptic source, which is propaganda for the Roman rule of Heraclius. And I can give you several scholars' names for that, notably Brandon Wheeler in his book, Moses in the Quran. As for the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, oh, we know who this came from. It's a story made by a Christian bishop. Oh, really? Maybe if you did more than just a surface reading of this, you would realize that what scholars have said. There's a German scholar called Koch. Now, his name is spelled K-O-C-H. And what he says is, he's examined the growth of this story and the spread of the legend of miraculously long sleep. He mentions that there are similar tales of these 7 sleepers at Sardes, and there are far more examples from various countries, such as Slavonic, Indian, Jewish, Chinese, and Arabian versions. Now, if these legends did come from Christian sources, can you explain to me how they got as far as China and India, when we know that the Christians didn't really missionize at that time? And how they're also prior to the Christian religion itself. Now, as to what else did Professor Wood bring up? He said that, oh well, we don't know Arabic. This is like saying produce something better than Shakespeare. Well, no, it's not. The Shakespeare's number one. People actually accuse Shakespeare of being plagiarized by a certain number of people. They say that Shakespeare actually plagiarized from a certain number of people. That's why certain plays of Shakespeare, we're not even sure who the author of these plays were. Number 2, that's a very subjective, aesthetic judgment, Dr. Wood. We're not saying that it's based on someone's likes. Someone likes this poetry more, therefore it's miraculous. I'm saying produce something that breaks the literary forms of the known Arabic language like the Quran does. And unless someone can do that, I'm going to remain believing in the Quran. Secondly, can you tell me how many people here can judge whether or not Moses split the sea or Jesus resurrected from the dead? None of us were there to witness it. Therefore, we are merely witnessing a phenomenon just like people are witnessing the phenomenon of the Quranic miracle. Now to the mistake of Ur of the Chaldeans. Dr. Wood says, oh, Ur of the Chaldeans, we know this is borrowed from a 1st century scribal error. Dr. Wood, it's a shame you haven't done much research on this, because then you would realize that Ur of the Chaldeans didn't even exist at the time of Abraham. This is considered a biblical anachronism. So, secondly, the word Ur in Hebrew actually means fire. So, how do we know that the Jews didn't just mistranslate the words? The Quran accuses them of hermeneutically distorting the Torah, so that might be the case. And lastly, I'm going to, according to the, sorry, I can't seem to find it on me right now, but I've got several biblical commentaries which mention that in the area where Ur was, in this Chaldean area, people used to punish people, as in the capital punishment was burning by fire. So, Dr. Woods, can you explain to me how this would have been an error when we know that people did burn by fire then? And, yeah. Okay. What else has Professor Wood brought up? He's brought up the Romans. He says, wow, this is like me saying that the Romans will get defeated in Iraq and they're going to come back. Well, no, it's kind of more like me saying, but the Romans are going to get invaded, lose 30 of their states, remain only 13 states, and they're going to bounce back as a great empire. Don't make it look like it was just 1 or 2 territories here, Dr. Woods. If you had only just studied the historical circumstances, you might realize it was a bit more. As for Suleiman and Orun from the Talmud, if you just research on this as well, you would realize that most academics are saying that the Targum of Esper actually postdates Islam. It's not pre-Islamic. And in fact, they're saying that, what's the word they're saying? We're saying that it's actually borrowed from the Quran. Now, Mr. Woods has a way out of this. He could say it existed as an oral story prior to the time of Islam, but if he does that, then he would have to concede that the Gnostic sources also existed as oral stories in the 1st century, seeing as we know they were compiled in the 2nd century. If you have a problem with stories coming from 2nd century sources, Mr. Woods, we're going to have some real problems with the New Testament and the book of Revelation, so on and so forth. And lastly, we know in the Gospel of Luke that he mentions that many other people have endeavored to write similar Gospel accounts. Yet today we have none of these Gospel accounts. Luke being first century, can you tell me where these Gospel accounts are and how we know that the creating birds out of a place where it was not found in the earliest Gospels? Thank you.
You've got 3 minutes left.
Oh, excellent. Can the person upload that program I wanted you to upload? The True Quran sources. Now, excellent. This is claimed by Dr. Wood's website, Answering Muslims, to be a match to the Quran. This is sort of free ayat nur. Now, we've actually examined which surahs they've been picking wholesale out of and shown that they've actually just taken verses from the Quran and placed them in a different sequential order, given the effect that it sounds like the Quran. Well, the challenge says, produce a chapter like the Quran, not steal a chapter from the Quran. Secondly, now David Wood's best friend, Michael Coleman, claimed that he asked a scholar of the Arabic language, a PhD student, whether this was miraculous in the Quran, and that PhD student said yes, it was. But he didn't want to give away his identity in case Muslims killed him. Can you tell us in any way how this is more miraculous in the Quran? And secondly, can you respond to how my criteria for judging the Quran's miraculous literary genre is subjective? Thank you.
You've still got 1.5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay. David brings up the fact that Jesus says that the Quran says that Jesus confirmed the law that was before him. Can you tell me when the Torah was compiled, when the Old Testament was compiled, and whether it was compiled before the time of Jesus or not? Another thing he brought up was, ask the people of the book. If you are in doubt, ask the people of the book. Now, what this ayah is, it's important, David Wood, that you look at tafsir, because the tafsir shows us that this ayah is telling Muhammad, we made the nation of Israel a great people. We bestowed them with blessings. And essentially it says, if you are in doubt about this, ask the people of the book. Now, what does Muhammad respond? He says, I neither doubt nor do I ask. It's important to read context, Mr. Wood. As for Ali Dashki and Gerdar Puin, his comments come from an article that was published 12 years ago in the Quran as a text by Stephen Wilde, I believe it was. And his comments were regarding the Sana'a manuscripts, which don't have any diacritical marks on them. Well, no doubt the Quran is not going to be mubin if we don't have any diacritical marks on us. Thankfully enough, scholarship has progressed since then. In this book here, Gregor Scholler affirms that the manuscripts we have from the Sana'a find are exactly the same as the manuscripts we have today, and there's no differences with the exception of slight orthographic variants where we write the alif in a different way. So please mention the context of your quotes in the future. Finally, as to Ali Dashki, well, you can quote a bitter Iranian who had a beef with Islam due to the Islamic Revolution if you want to, and had about 4 years study classical Arabic. If he wants to lecture scholars and Arabists who are PhDs in Arabic studies, he's fine to do so. But anyone who reads Arabic or Persian here, I recommend you read Mustafa Tabataba'i's refutation of Ali Dashki's so-called grammatical errors, and that actually covers most of it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. David, you have 10 minutes too.
All right, well, Yahya says I didn't give him enough time. I did only have 4 main arguments, and I don't expect him to respond to every little point, but I did have 4 points about the Quran. I don't think that's too overwhelming. Well, I've argued that we can't trust Muhammad because we can't trust the Quran, and we can't trust the Quran because in every instance where we can actually sit down and test it, the Quran turns out to be wrong. If we can't trust the Quran when it comes to historical facts, for instance, how can we possibly trust it on matters of salvation? Now let's see how Yahya has responded. I argued that the central argument of the Quran, which I call the argument from literary excellence, is flawed. It makes no sense to point to literary quality as proof of divine origin. And even if literary excellence were a criterion of divine origin, the Quran would fail because it's just not that impressive. He says, will people accuse Shakespeare of plagiarism? Great. According to the Quran, we know that people accuse Muhammad of plagiarism. So I don't understand the point. He says that people can't examine Moses' miracles or Jesus' resurrection. So why am I complaining that most people can't examine the literary excellence of the Quran? Well, that's simply wrong. Anyone in this room right now can go walk out and examine Jesus' resurrection from the dead. You can examine the historical evidence, the sources that say Jesus died, and you can examine the sources, the historical evidence and the testimony that say he was alive again after he died. Anyone can examine this evidence, whereas when it comes to the Quran, even if we all decide right now, hey, I'd love to go and investigate this argument, most of us can't unless we're willing to, dedicate 60 years of our lives to mastering classical Arabic and ancient literary forms. He says that people who have attempted to produce a chapter like this, like the Quran, have failed. Failed according to whom? To Muslims? Notice what the challenge is. If you are in doubt, then try to produce a chapter like it. See if you can. According to this argument, if I sit down and try to write something like a chapter of the Quran, I'm going to realize it just can't be done, and I'm going to realize that this must be the Word of God. That's not what happens. You see, Muslims have set themselves up as the judges of this challenge. So they say, you go try and write something like it, and then bring it to us, and we'll tell you whether it's the Quran, which we believe is the infallible Word of God. Is that what the challenge says? No, this is a test for unbelievers. We're supposed to realize that it can't be done. But no one ever does this. The person who writes the true Furqan really believes, hey, I've written something like the Quran. And it's just Muslims who already believe that it's the Word of God who say, no, you haven't. Well, you're going against what Muhammad actually challenged the unbelievers to do here. Now I want to look at he said, can I show him how his method is subjective? Well, when anyone says, here, the Quran is really, really good, he says, that's a good scholar, you can trust what he says. When someone like Yerpuin or Ali Dashti say, no, it's not, it's got all kinds of flaws and it's incomprehensible, he says, don't believe these biased people, what do they know? Well, you can do that with anything. If 100 scholars sit down on one side, and another 100 scholars sit down on the other side, and one group says, yes, it can't be, no one can produce something like this, and the other side says, of course, anyone can produce something like this. Well, you could always say, well, that group must be wrong. Why? Because the Quran is perfect, and anyone who says otherwise must be biased. I'd like to look at a passage here. This is Surah 28, 48 through 49. People are talking about the Torah and the Quran and the miraculous nature of the Quran. Earlier, Yahya said that people acknowledge the Quran as miraculous, and then he complained about the Torah. The passage reads, but now when the truth has come to them from ourselves, they say, why are not signs sent to him like those which were sent to Moses? So why isn't Muhammad performing miracles? Do they not then reject the signs which were formerly sent to Moses? So people also reject the signs of Moses. They say, two kinds of sorcery, each assisting the other. The kinds of sorcery refer to the Quran and the Torah. And they say, for us, we reject all such things. Say, then bring a book from Allah, which is a better guide than either of them, that I may follow it. Do it if you are truthful. So some people were referring to the Torah in the time of Muhammad as magic that rivaled the magic of the Quran. Now, the point of all this is, one, the Quran was not unsurpassable if people are seeing it in the same light as they see the Torah. Two, people understood that Muhammad wasn't performing miracles, but most important here, the Torah was certainly around in the time of Muhammad. We find constant references. Let's get to this in a second. I argue that the Quran claims to be perfectly consistent and that it appeals to this as evidence of divine origin. And as soon as we open it up, we start to find discrepancies. We find abrogated verses So how can the Quran put this forward as some kind of evidence? Now Yahya went on to try and reconcile some of the passages. Again, I have absolutely no problem. You can reconcile every one of them. You can reinterpret every one of them. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the Quran presents this as a challenge to unbelievers. If you want to know whether this is the word of God, you come and you won't find any discrepancies. Again, I go there and one passage says penalty for sexual sin this, another passage says something completely different, and yet it says it contains no discrepancies. So this isn't something where we go to it, the Quran makes the challenge, and then we go and see that the challenge has been met. The Quran is totally consistent. It's not. But even if it were completely consistent, it wouldn't be surprising to have a perfectly consistent book written by one man over a period of a little over 2 decades. So one, here again, the challenge is flawed, and two, once again, the Quran fails the challenge. Regarding the argument from perfect accuracy, that the Quran is accurate in every way, I argue that the Quran claims to be perfectly consistent, and that it appeals to evidence of its divine origin, and that it also claims to be accurate in every way. Now, regarding the contradictions, Yahya said there's no contradiction regarding Pharaoh because the passage says that Pharaoh, his body was going to be saved, but that's not what the passage says. Let me give you 3 translations. Pickthall, but this day we save thee in thy body, that you may be a portent to those after you. We're saving you in your body. That means you're going to be alive. Yusuf Ali, this day we save you in your body, that you may be a sign to those who come after me. And make Shakir, but we will, this day we will deliver you with your body, so that you may be a sign to those after you, and most surely the majority of people are heedless of our communications. So Pharaoh repents, and God says, now I'm going to save you in your body, you're going to be alive, and this is going to be a sign of everyone that I have miraculous power to save. This doesn't say anything about Pharaoh's body being saved so that thousands of years later people are going to find his body and think that this is some sort of sign for Islam. So we simply have the one passage saying that Pharaoh was saved and another passage saying that he died. The Alexander legend, he said it dated to after Muhammad's time. Well, now, I don't know, the scholar I read said it was dated to the end of Muhammad's life. So this was circulating as sort of a propaganda for Heraclius, but this was during the lifetime of Muhammad. But regardless, the various sources we have, again, of course you can always reinterpret something. You can always say, look, even if I have all these sources, source after source after source, and we see the same stories in the Quran, and historians regard these stories as completely false, you can always say, well, you know, Muhammad got it right and these stories must be true. Think of this as a non-Muslim for just a second. Just imagine, suppose I come to you and I say that I'm a prophet, and I start trying to give you evidence of my knowledge from history, but you see that all my knowledge about Scotland comes from the movie Braveheart, and that all my knowledge of other things comes from other movies. Well, these were the stories that were circulating in the time of Muhammad. This was the Hollywood at that time, and every story that was circulating in Arabia during the time of Muhammad suddenly ends up in the Quran, whether it's true or not. This doesn't look like evidence that the man's a prophet. Regarding the argument from biblical confirmation, the Quran claims to derive support from the Bible. It says you can go to Christians and Jews for confirmation, and we're certainly not going to confirm Torah. Yahya says, can I tell him when the Torah was compiled, and can I tell him what the other Gospels were? I don't understand. If you could clarify what the point of the question is. Yes, there were other Gospels. Luke based his writings on certain other Gospels. These would be similar to early Muslim writings, which are no longer extant, but people preserved the ones that were most authoritative, that they could trace, that were most in line with the teachings of Jesus' early followers. But regardless, I'm sorry, I'm out of time.
Okay, well, yeah. Okay, you
Thank you, David. We've got to finish this evening by 9:20 for prayers, and it's now 9 o'clock. The two speakers are also going to give a 5-minute summary at the end as well. So that's 10 minutes. So that takes us to 9:10. So we have 10 minutes for questions, unfortunately. Okay? So raise your hands. You've got questions. The guy right at the very back there. shout, that would help. Well, I'll repeat your question if you can't hear.
Why don't you give him a mic?
Come to that mic then.
Yeah, give him
John,
a mic so we can hear it.
What respectable Dr. Wood, I want to just ask, do you have your Bible with you or references to the Bible? If I ask you the quotation, would you be able to find it pretty quickly?
Yes.
Okay, sir. In Samuel 2,
You mean 1 Samuel 2 or 2 Samuel?
2 Samuel,
Okay.
and chapter 24, verse 13.
Okay.
How many years of famine have you mentioned there, sir?
So are you going to try to point out a contradiction in the Bible?
Well, this
If everyone wants to walk away from here thinking the Bible's been corrupt, I don't see how it's part of this debate.
Let's just answer the question. All I'm trying to say is because Okay,
I'm not going to allow this question to proceed because it's not on the subject. The subject tonight is about the Prophet Muhammad, okay? Not about Bible contradictions. I appreciate what you're trying to say, but it's not on the subject. Yes, sir.
This will be on the subject.
Good.
Okay, now you said that one of the reasons why you would say that the Quran is not the Word of God is because it has stories which are found in earlier sources. However, how come you're not consistent to reject the Bible for the same reason? Because scholars have seen similarities with some of the commandments in the Old Testament with the Code of Hammurabi, which dates earlier. Noah's flood story is similar to the Gilgamesh, which is prior. There's also other similarities in the Bible with Israeli ancient text and the Nuzi text, which date prior to that. So why are you being consistent and applying double standards? Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question, Bassam. Now, when we examine something like the flood, or when we examine the stories found in the Quran, we have to ask, do both of these sources, so let's say the Old Testament and certain other texts, do they tell the same flood story because one copied from the other, or do they both tell the flood story because there was an actual flood? We have to ask that question. If there was some sort of actual flood, then it's not surprising that both texts would contain the same story. And I would say the same thing about teachings in the Quran. So if the Arabic infancy gospel says that Jesus spoke at birth, and the Quran says Jesus spoke at birth, there are two possibilities. One, the Quran was copying a false story. Or two, both of those stories are accurate. And if this only happened once, there are only one or two instances where the Quran seemed to contain a story that was drawn from, a weak source. I would not accuse it. I would say, okay, I'll give the Quran the benefit of the doubt here. But when we see it over and over and over again with practically every story Muhammad tells, then we have to start getting suspicious. Now, even with that said, I wouldn't say that's by itself is conclusive proof. What I'm referring to in this debate is that we see a clear pattern of the Quran making claims for itself, and when we test those claims, we find out that the evidence doesn't support them.
Tonight I contested historical inaccuracies in the Quran and borrowing theories as Mr. Wood claimed. He hasn't actually responded to any of my contentions with those borrowing stories. For example, he just goes, well, the scholar I read said it was after. Which scholar did you read, Mr. Wood? It doesn't work in a debate to go, the scholar I read. We want names, we want dates. And explain why it mentions Arab invasion of the world if this process did not start until after the Prophet Muhammad's death.
I assume the questions are going to come from the floor, not from the other speakers. Do you want to answer that, or should I go?
No, sorry, it was my mistake.
Okay, right. More questions. Right, yes, so the guy with the long hair. Do that.
Question for Yahya. Is there any proof outside of Islam, outside of Islamic traditions and texts, like the Quran had it and the Hadith, that Muhammad was a prophet and that he even existed?
That's an excellent question. As I said, historical Muhammad studies is one of my favorite areas. We actually have a text from a Christian Armenian chronicler called Silios, who's writing 1 year after Muhammad's death. 1 year after Muhammad's death. And what he writes is that the Ishmaelites have claimed a prophet who has returned them to the God of our father Abraham, and he has brought them a law and has brought them a sacred book. So this would suggest that the Quran was compiled and that they had a Sharia by this time.
Thank you, any of the sisters got any questions? No questions from sisters at all? Okay. Gentleman over there.
In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul warns Christians to reject any revelation that claims to be from an angel that contradicts the gospel given to him and to the other early Christians. Does Yahya accept that Christians at the time of Muhammad were right to reject his message as a prophet because he contradicted that message?
I accept that Christians who were deluded by Paul of Tarsus' propaganda would have accepted that. And I find it ironic that Paul says, don't follow an angel of light, when he himself has a vision of light on the road to Damascus. But what I would say is that Christians at the time of Muhammad, they had a means of interpreting a text. They had the analogical, the anagogical, the metaphorical and the literal interpretation of the text. So many Christians at the time, as you can read in Ibn Ishaq and Tabari, they actually went back to the Bible and they saw Muhammad in the scripture more than they actually saw Jesus. For example, there's a book called Muslim Views on Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, which shows many of these passages which the early Muslims appealed to within the Torah and Talmudic sources for Muhammad and the Christian writings that were available at the time for Muhammad.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, for Mr. Wood. Hi. Going back to methodology. When you objectively analyze scripture, how do you verify the difference between plagiarism and revelation of known content? Like a confirmation of what people already know. Like Jesus did to the Jews. Jews may have accused Jesus of saying, you're plagiarizing. Yeah. Or previous facts.
So just clarify your... Oh.
Yeah. So what determines the difference of the two? What science and methodology is used to determine the difference between plagiarism and revelation of known facts, known previous facts?
Okay, so if we read a story, how do I know it's plagiarism, not just reporting known facts?
Well, it's probably a common origin of all knowledge, God Almighty.
Okay, well, yeah, I would say 1 or 2 or 3 instances would not be enough. But, I mean, imagine the difference between me coming along and saying I'm a prophet and reporting something that's common knowledge versus me claiming to be a prophet and reporting things that are based on Hollywood movies or something like that. If I refer to something that happened to be in the movie Gladiator, for instance, you could say, well, Gladiator had some historical background. These things did happen. So again, I wouldn't say that, if you just see this once or twice or 3 times, but if we see a steady series of stories and we go back and say, where do we find the origin of these stories? If we find that in many, many instances, the origin seems to be a source that's circulating in Arabia and seems to be, spurious, or if people understood it to be a fable. If we see many instances of this, then I think we're right for being suspicious.
Okay, the gentleman who had his hand up there, yes, you stand up, please.
For Professor Woods, you mentioned the dual tests where we compared the gospel and what it says, and in both counts you said Prophet Muhammad would be wrong. I think you follow what I'm trying to point to. But when you point us to the gospel, we have problems there, because the gospel you're talking about refers to resurrection, which we follow where it's being pointed to Mary Magdalene, pointing us to resurrection as a proof, pointing us to St. Paul's years later writing the book. And then we find the Sinai Bibles recently found doesn't mention resurrection at all. So when you point us to the gospel, and therefore point to both premises falling, then our problem is the gospel as you presented. We fail to rely on that, and therefore we cannot rely on you discounting both premises.
I'm not sure I understand completely, but regarding the gospel, if you're referring to the gospel as a text, this was a misunderstanding of Muhammad. There was never any book, just the gospel. When we trace, the question before us is what material goes back to the 1st century? We know that Mark is a 1st century document, that Luke is a 1st century document, that Matthew is a 1st century document, that John is a 1st century document. You have people quoting these books by the end of the 1st century. It's obvious that they existed in that century. So if the question is, if we're going to base our beliefs on, what are we going to base our beliefs on Jesus on? It seems we'd have to go with the earliest evidence. And it just happens that the earliest evidence we have tells us that Jesus claimed to be divine, that he died on the cross, that he rose from the dead, and no text that comes from the 1st century contradicts any one of those 3 facts.
So I'm very sorry, that is the end of the questions. It's 9:10. We've got 10 minutes left. Each speaker is now going to give their final summary, and then the evening is concluded. So I'll hand over to Yahya.
Tonight, Mr. Wood has done several things. He's not really responded to my historical accuracy of the Quran. All he said is, well, we expect Muhammad to get a few things right. Yeah, but surely we don't expect the Quran to get almost every crucial area of a pharaoh of Moses' time right, and we don't expect it to correct anachronisms within the Bible if he's plagiarizing from the Bible. Ironically enough, scholars like Gerard Bowering, who happens to write the same book about the Alexander myth in the Quran in its historical context, published last year by Routledge Publications, states we cannot find a single source for the Quran for which we could suggest the Quran has plagiarized from wholesale. In regards to Mr. Wood saying that the Quran has scientific errors, I don't think Mr. Wood nor I are qualified enough to speak on this debate. However, if his friend Nabil wants to debate one of my friends, I can easily arrange a debate on that. I'm not personally an expert on science, so I'm not going to contest anything. That's not even being part of my case tonight. In regards to me wholesale rejecting scholars that David Wood quotes, no, all I did was point you in the correct context of those quotes. I pointed out that Gerd R. Buin's comments on the Quran not being Mubin came in light of him analysing manuscripts where the diacritical marks were missing. So please don't attack me strawman and accuse me of things I haven't said. That's very inconsistent of you, Mr. Wood. In regards to every earliest source mentioning the resurrection of Jesus, well, I'm going to accept your friend Nabil Qureshi, who's your partner on this ministry's testimony that we can trust the Q Gospel and the Q document, since he quoted it in his debate with Paul. According to contemporary scholars, Daniel Smith and another scholar called Zeller are saying that the Q document does not mention anything about a resurrection, rather mentions a bodily assumption into heaven, which is actually more in line with the Islamic view. So tonight we've seen that I've mentioned proof from Muhammad as a historical accuracy of the Quran, linguistic miracle of the Quran, which David Wood just likes to throw across and be like, well, we can read it in English, it's just as good. And I've quoted other things in the Quran, such as prophecies. David Wood says that the Ummah had already divided into schisms before this prophecy was fulfilled, but can he show me where it had divided into schisms the way that the Prophet had described in that hadith? I've told you this hadith is from the 8th century, and I've told you that the sect which venerates Ali as part of the Trinity is from the 10th to the 11th century. In conclusion, I think we have very good reason to believe that the Prophet Muhammad was a prophet of God. And in fact, David, I'm willing to debate you on Muhammad in the Bible in 1 year's time, if you're up for that. Because I certainly don't have enough time to bring up the evidence for that in this debate. Thank you.
We've got 5 minutes, whenever you want.
All right, well, in this debate, I'll give you my view. I don't think we've seen a single successful argument for the prophethood of Muhammad. I'll respond to a few last-moment objections. He asked, we had a question, were Christians justified in rejecting Muhammad because Paul says to reject an angel who contradicts the gospel? And Yahya seemed to think that Paul was inconsistent because he believed in an appearance that came to him, an appearance of Jesus. No, there's one massive difference. Paul went to the apostles to make sure that his message lined up with what Jesus actually taught and did. Muhammad never had that opportunity. So if we're going to trust someone who's going to tell us about the historical Jesus, we can trust someone who, but by the way, both men claimed to receive revelations about Jesus. The only difference was one of them had an opportunity to go to Jesus' followers and ask them, is my message in line with the teachings of Jesus? That's what he did. His teachings line up with what we find in the Gospels. Of course we have to trust what Paul says about Jesus. Regarding the historical claims, historical evidence for the Quran, it's very easy to point to anything that in a book that is accurate and say this confirms the message, but what do you do when you pull out a fact and every shred of evidence we have from all of history contradicts what the Quran claims? The Quran says Jesus did not die by crucifixion. every shred of evidence we have from every single source, whether we go to Christian sources, Jewish sources, or Roman sources. Every shred of evidence we can ever find tells us that Jesus died by crucifixion. Every scholar you will find in historical Jesus studies, whether atheist or agnostic or Christian or Jewish, will tell you that Jesus died by crucifixion. And we open the Quran and see, no, God just tricked everyone into thinking that Jesus died by crucifixion. Well, why do you not here say Muhammad got something wrong? When all of history contradicts something Muhammad said, why do you not then say, hey, he got this wrong? I don't know. It just seems inconsistent. He says that scholars say there's not a source that Muhammad copied wholesale. I agree, by the way. There's no source that Muhammad sat down and copied word for word. That's not how Muhammad would have done this. These stories were, this was an oral culture. Stories circulated orally. So people are telling a story about Abraham being delivered from the fire. People are telling stories about Alexander the Great. And Muhammad hears them, and again, he doesn't know which stories are true and which stories are false, and so they all end up in the Quran. He says that Puan was only referring to manuscripts without diacritical marks. Well, unless there were no diacritical marks before Puan said this just a few years ago, it seems that I don't know where he's getting this. He says the Quran is incomprehensible in certain verses. Diacritical marks were not invented in the last few years. He says the Q document doesn't talk about a resurrection. Well, the Q document was a collection of Jesus' sayings. Imagine if you wrote down some things I said. It's not a book giving a historical narrative. The Q source was just, Jesus said this, Jesus said this, Jesus said this. It's not a book which says, and then Jesus did this, and then he ascended into heaven, and then he did all these things. So this isn't a historical text. It's a book of sayings. We don't expect to find historical narrative. He says, Muhammad referred to schisms that were going to arise, but these didn't arise by the time we have the quote. Look, immediately after Muhammad died, Muslims started fighting amongst themselves. Not long after Muhammad's death, Aisha marched out an army against Ali, and thousands of Muslims died in a bloody battle because Aisha didn't like the way Ali handled the death of Uthman. Read about it. If this is not a schism, I don't know what is. Thousands of people who fought at battle were slaughtering each other over a disagreement. If that's not a schism, I don't know what is. So I'll just say we go to the Quran, and we find that the Quran makes claims for itself again and again. According to the Quran, we know that it's the Word of God because of its unsurpassable evidence. I showed that this claim is flawed on multiple levels. This would make Mozart a prophet. The Quran says that there's support for Muhammad in the Bible, and yet the Bible declares that Muhammad was a false prophet. The Quran tells people to go to the Jews and Christians for confirmation, and yet Jews and Christians believe that Muhammad was a false prophet. The Quran claims to be completely without discrepancy, but we've seen numerous discrepancies. Yes, you can reinterpret, you can harmonize, you can throw out history or science in order to get the Quran to line up, but you can do that with any text. So ask yourself, if a man comes to you and says all kinds of things, and every time you go and investigate these things, you find out the claims fail, why would you trust him with your salvation?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Yahya, for a fascinating evening. I'd just like to mention that tomorrow our events continue. We have a further debate with David Wood, in fact, and with Abdullah tomorrow on the concept of God in Islam and Christianity. That takes place in North London in 45 Crawford Place, Abra House. The nearest tube is Edgware Road. That's tomorrow evening. And before that, we have a debate, has the Quran been perfectly preserved? And that's at 12:30 tomorrow. The other debate I mentioned is at 5:15. The Quran debate on at 12:30 in North London. You're very welcome to attend, and thank you very much for this evening, and good night.
Same place.
All right, this is David Wood with my main man here, Yahya Seymour. We had a debate the other day on the prophethood of Muhammad. I realized that in my conclusion, I referred to Jesus' crucifixion as something where the historical evidence seems to conflict with what we read in the Quran. I realized he didn't have a chance to respond to that, so we're going to attach this on the end of the video so that he has a chance to tell us what he thinks about crucifixion and what we find in the Quran.
All right, sure.
I'd like to thank David for firstly giving me a chance to respond. I think that's very decent of him. What I'd like to comment on was the fact he brought crucifixion in our debate. David made a statement that the Quran says the crucifixion never happened, and all historical scholars say that it did. I'd like to first correct him about all historical scholars. Barbara Fearing, who is qualified in this area, does actually say it never happened. She might not be taken seriously in academia, but it just proves that the statement he made was an overgeneralization. Secondly, the Quran includes the clause, but the event was made to appear so unto them. Therefore, with this one historical anachronism, the Quran includes a clause showing that it's not as black and white as people think. Thank you very much.